It's my life. Okay, hello and welcome to our education policy seminar today. I am Erica Sachs-Langerham, a fourth-year PhD student in education policy here at the School of Education and Development. This talk is part of the Education Policy Works seminar series sponsored by the Bankard Fund for Political Economy. Each semester, EdPolicyWorks hosts a number of talks from external and sometimes internal speakers on a host of education policy and research related topics. These talks are free and open to the public. Our next speaker will be Dr. Andrew Simon on Monday, October 28th here in Holloway Hall. For more information on EdPolicyWorks or our next seminar, please Today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Mimi Lyon. Dr. Lyon is an assistant professor of public policy at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at the University of Albany, Melissa studies the political economy of education policy, focusing on labor, governance, and teacher politics and policy. Her current work centers around labor politics, especially teacher strikes, see on the screen, teacher labor markets, and shifts in education governance like state takeovers. Her research has been published in numerous journals, including Educational Researcher, Journal of Human Resources, American Educational Research Journal, and more. Mimi's work has been covered extensively in national and local news media, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, CNN, the Today Show, NPR's Morning Edition, and CBS News. Mimi received her doctorate from Columbia University. Prior to grad school, was a 6th grade teacher in Houston, Texas. Dr. Lyon will be talking for approximately 1 hour and will leave about 15 minutes for discussion and questions. Please note that any additional or personalized questions afterwards can be addressed via email as other meetings will begin at that time. Thank you for attending the Education Policy Seminar today. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lyon to the meeting.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really, really excited to be here. As she said, my name is Melissa Arnold Lyon. Please feel free to call me Mimi. That's what I prefer. And I'm presenting today on the causes and consequences of teacher strikes. I'm supposed to say at the beginning, this work is graciously funded by a postdoctoral fellowship from the Spencer Foundation. And this is also joint work with colleagues at Brown University at Craft and then Matthew Steinberg at Accelerate. So a little bit about me before, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. So as she mentioned, I was a 6th grade teacher before I came to graduate school. I was a 6th grade teacher in Houston, Texas. And I was at a no excuses charter school. I was also an instructional coach. And I think that period of time was really formative for me. Partially because I was really, really miserable. And it was very much a feeling of working within a system that I felt like I was really trying to make the system work and the system was just really not working. And so I came to graduate school to try to understand that. So I got my PhD from Teachers College at Columbia University. I was a COVID graduate. So I defended my dissertation in 2020. And this was my graduation ceremony. I also, you can feel bad for me because you can see that in the peak of COVID, when I had to finish my dissertation, I had a very small child who is now older and still not very well behaved. But and then now, so I did a postdoc at Brown. This was in Providence at the Annenberg Institute with a number of UVA graduates and folks that have had intermittent relationships with y'all, and now I'm an assistant professor at the University of Albany. So a little bit about my research. I think about my research as the political economy of education and policy, answering big questions about the ways that economic inequalities shape the politics of education, and then also how education governance institutions shape how the incentives and behaviors of market actors work. Sort of within and around educational systems. And so ultimately, my sort of driving goal is to try to help us to create educational systems that are more equitable for students and for teachers. And you can sort of see the kind of pillars I think of are inequality, governance, and teacher politics and policy. And then within that, I've been focused a lot recently on you can think about my teacher strike work as sort of like in between teacher unionization and teacher labor. And it's potentially not a big surprise because I'm really sort of a driving thing that I want to try to understand is how teachers can have a say. And like how teachers can and do become voices that matter in terms of education, policy, and politics, but also like broader political and economic systems. So why study strikes? There is generally a sense especially amongst economists, but also amongst like labor historians and folks, that labor's been on the decline, and that strikes have been on the decline and essentially ineffective since about 1981, when Reagan fired the striking air traffic controllers. So there's an economist came out with a couple of economists came out with a really great paper recently, sort of showing that prior to the PATCO strike, strikes were effective at raising compensation. And then since then, up until about 2000, strikes have essentially become ineffective. And that's, I think, the way that a lot of labor organizers and others have sort of talked about, and labor politics folks have thought about like worker power more generally as sort of like reaching a turning point around the early 80s and being on the decline. So then in that context, it's sort of a puzzle and a surprise why so many, like hundreds of thousands of folks, including a few hundreds of thousands of teachers, would be going on strike. So in 2018, we saw almost 400,000 teachers go on strike in these Red for Ed waves of teacher strikes. So teachers were about 78% of the workers involved in large work stoppages in that year. And that seems to have also potentially been another turning point where since then there have been increasing numbers of strikes and other types of work stoppages. So a quick, too long didn't read on the study. And this is also a good time to say that I very much appreciate questions throughout the whole presentation. And so this is also, if we have so many questions that I don't get through everything, then at least you'll know the highlights. So my research questions are essentially threefold. So how common are teacher strikes and where do they occur? Why do teacher strikes occur? And then what are the effects of teacher strikes on compensation, working conditions, and productivity, student achievement? So I'm using an original data set, which I'll tell you a lot more about, that I developed essentially during my postdoc at Annenberg with a team of research assistants and Matt and Matthew, who are also co-authors on this paper. So we created a process of developing a new data set. And then for this paper, we're combining that with data on school finance from the Common Core of Data, and then also CETA data on student achievement. So the big takeaways are there have probably been a lot more strikes than you might expect. So in the past 16 years, there have been 772 teacher strikes. And overwhelmingly, the strikes involve advocacy for higher compensation, so salaries and benefits. 9 out of 10 strikes are involve demands for greater compensation. Working conditions is also a key factor in about 60% of the strikes, and then they do affect those things. So we find that they have that they increase annual teacher compensation by about 8%. Which is equivalent to about $10,000 in annual compensation, right? And then they have also a similar percentage effect on working conditions, which we look at a few different ways, I'll explain. And then we find no effect on student achievement for the typical strike. The typical strike doesn't affect student achievement within 5 years. And it's important to, and I'll go into the details obviously, but the typical strike is a short strike. So most of the teacher strikes in the US are 2/3 of the teacher strikes in the US are less than a school week long. So 5 days or less long. So a school week or shorter. And the modal strike is 1 day. So you may not expect for that kind of short strike to really have a big effect on student achievement. We do see that longer teacher strikes, those that last 2 school weeks or more, have a negative effect on student achievement in math in the year of the strike and then the subsequent year, but that dissipates as time goes on.
You can feel your point on this, but I was actually thinking about the achievement results as well, there's this whole money matters
Yeah.
literature, and so here's more money. Maybe not, but maybe it's reallocation, but my sense is that this is more money, so why no gain from the cheap?
Yeah, exactly. So there's like, on the one hand, there's the instructional time loss question. On the other hand, there's like the money matters question. We were also thinking about this quite a bit. So, and I have a whole bit on it that I'll show you, but the short thing is that probably that we're limited by the CETA year range, and CETA, they're like, unless Sean Reardon like invents tests that didn't exist before, there's not gonna be like there's always gonna be this shift in 2020. And so we're pre-2020, so we really can't say much definitively past 5 years after the strike, and that's just not gonna have been enough time, because we don't see the school finance, we don't see the increases to salaries right away. It takes a bit of time. And so in order to see the what the school finance literature sort of considers as the time we'd expect to see an effect on student achievement, we need to have essentially 9 years out after the strike, 8 or 9 years out, depending on how you want to interpret that. And so, and when we look 8 or 9 years out, we don't have very many strikes. And so confidence intervals are pretty big, but the estimates that you would expect from the school finance literature on like money mattering are within that range. So I'll show you some of that down the road, but that's something we're also thinking about. I think the short answer is just we don't have enough time. And maybe down the road, post-COVID, when if more strikes continue to happen, we could do that again, but COVID's always gonna sort of be a tough place to estimate. Or maybe Sean Reardon will come back and do some more CETA in the post period that can add on, but we'll see.
Maybe
Uh-huh.
you're getting to this, but like, how should we think about like a strike, like in terms of, is it like a
Defining
point in time? Like, how do you think about like coordinated strikes across places? Are they local and statewide?
Yeah, I will explain, but I can just tell you now. So we measure them at the district level. And we measure a strike as having happened if the district closes school. So if you think about it that way, it's a little bit easier to conceptualize. So that's going to include walkouts, any type of work stoppage where the district had to close school. And so if for the coordinated strikes, we count the number of districts that close school. So like in Virginia, you guys had a coordinated strike where a lot of teachers came to the Capitol, but only 4 districts had to close school. So we count that as 4 strikes in Virginia. In Arizona, they had they had strikes that had more workers on strike and also more districts having closed school, but not all districts had to close school. And so that was part of the, what was really time intensive about this process was trying to identify which were the districts that actually closed school. The good news is that there's almost always a press release telling parents to can't send your kids to school today because the teachers are on strike. So it is information that is possible to find, because they have to tell the parents somehow.
Probably you're gonna talk about this too, but I wonder if it seems like strikes at maybe a bigger scale would be more meaningful to decision makers. Are you able to control for the size of the strike, or whether it happened at the state level in addition to the district level in terms of measuring potential for impact?
We do it in a I'm certainly open to feedback on this, and I'm about to tell you, but we do it in a sort of leave out way. So we estimate the effects separately. We look just at individual district strikes, and this is not the main part of the paper. We think about it more as a robustness check, because honestly, it doesn't look that different. But we look at the effects of just individual district strikes, and then also the effects of just coordinated strikes across districts. And the one main difference in the findings is that the coordinated strikes are the ones that really seem to have greater impacts on working conditions, not on pupil-teacher ratios specifically. And that's also consistent with their demands. So it's sort of it's a kind of nice coherent story. So you'll see coordinated strikes tend to focus more on school and working conditions factors relative to individual strikes, focusing more on compensation more narrowly. And then that's also consistent with the results. But otherwise, they look pretty similar. Okay. So we have a working paper out. It is not fully baked. there are a number of different reasons why it is not fully baked and why we put out the working paper now, including that one of my co-authors is now in the Council of Economic Advisors, but his co-authorship on that project is not reflected of any government stuff. He is exclusively in his capacity as a professor at Brown on this project. And so we're still very open to feedback. I think especially you'll see we built out this data set, which is, I think, providing some new contextual knowledge, and people are constantly telling us they want to know more about the strikes, and we do have more information, but we need a little bit more specificity on what people might be interested in knowing. I think another big thing is that a lot of folks are asking about the policy implications and still sort of figuring that out. So if you have thoughts on analyses or just like ways that you might be thinking about the policy implications, that would also be very helpful. And of course, any additional robustness checks or anything else that you might want to see or think it's not important is still very useful. And if you want to read the full paper, it's out publicly available. You can find it. Okay, so a little bit of background on teacher strikes, partly just because I like history and I like to start all my papers with like in 1941. But so the first recorded teacher strike that we could find, that I could find, was in 1929 in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where the teachers went on strike. This is from the New York Times machine thing. I don't know if you guys have used that. That's like the historical one. And so I think it was like 40 teachers go on strike because they haven't been paid for 6 months. And then strikes seemed to increase in the period after that. And teacher strikes specifically were a relatively common occurrence in the 1960s and 1970s when teachers were pushing for collective bargaining rights at the local and state levels. But then what happened was in a lot of states, the collective bargaining, so then states did grant collective bargaining rights to public sector workers, not all states. Virginia was kind of a funky one, as some of you guys might know, but when states, and this had to happen at the state level because public sector workers are excluded from the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. So like the laws governing private sector workers don't apply to public school teachers. So they do in the 1960s and 70s get collective bargaining rights at the state level in a lot of states. And a lot of times those policies involved this sort of compromise between like collective bargaining rights for labor peace. And so that was like the conceptual compromise, but what that meant was we'll give you collective bargaining rights, but we're gonna make strikes illegal. And sometimes the consequences are not really enforceable, like fire all the teachers, put the union leaders in jail, and revoke all the teacher licenses. And those kinds of consequences have never been administered, but some places like New York State, my home state, my current home state, I'm not originally from New York, they have more enforceable consequences that probably seem to be pretty effective. And New York was sort of a hotbed also for teacher strike activity, and then that essentially stops. And so I put this quote here though, because it's important. So 37 states, teacher strikes are illegal. We actually find that teacher strikes are more common in states where they're illegal than in states where they're legal. And some of that has to do with these unenforceable consequences, but also it's consistent with just like broader labor ideas, including this like labor maxim. There's no such thing as an illegal strike, only an unsuccessful one. Another way of thinking about it, there's like some like pseudo quote of a guy, you know, who's like, show me an illegal strike and I'll show you a failed strike. With the idea that like, if you can have enough collective mobilization such that administering the consequences would be impossible, then illegality doesn't super matter. So those are like sort of ideas percolating. And so we're looking at the effects of teacher strikes on essentially what they're demanding, but compensation and working conditions, and also productivity. And I think it's worth thinking about like conceptually how that might occur. So economists used to be really interested in strikes, largely in the private sector. And there were like some great guys, like really top guys, Card and Kruger, doing work on strikes. And this body of research essentially stopped around the same time that the Bureau of Labor Statistics stopped collecting data on strikes involving fewer than 1,000 workers. This also matters for us because 97% of school districts employ fewer than 1,000 workers. So by not collecting data on these strikes, we're probably missing a lot of teacher strikes. But generally, the ideas from that sort of earlier literature was this idea that strikes occur as a result of information asymmetry, where the workers don't know the extent of a firm's surplus, and so the workers hold out as long as they can to force the firm to reveal information about its profit margins and like how much they could raise salaries. And so we have, my colleague Matt Kraft and I have a paper that's out at JHR that is saying, okay, that may be true for public sector strikes. And I think there's some of that kind of like bilateral negotiation type way of thinking about strikes makes sense in the public sector, but also we can think about public sector strikes as important for their signaling mechanism. And so we can think about public sector strikes as signaling more broadly that there are problems, that there's problems in education, there's the need for political and economic change in education. And so in thinking about teacher strikes, we think that some of this sort of bilateral, thinking about strikes as this like bilateral negotiating tactic is not exactly right. And there's also another reason to think that some of the work on private sector strikes might not translate over to teacher strikes, because just we haven't found that, the technology and outsourcing and replacing workers with, scabs or whatever you want to call them, is just different with teaching than it would be for other occupations. So we haven't really seen technology change the number of teachers needed per student. We haven't seen a real systematic effort to outsource teacher jobs, and they're harder to replace partly because of licensing requirements and also partly because communities care about their teachers that are standing in front of their kids. So I think the effects on salaries and working conditions are more straightforward. You sort of expect that maybe they could reduce salaries in the very short term if teachers are fined, and that is the case in some laws that if and some private work on private strikes has found that you see a salary reduction right immediately because of fines administered. But for the most part, you'd either expect that they don't work and salaries don't change, or you expect that they do work in that sense and salaries increase. Similar for working conditions. But for productivity, it's a little bit more ambiguous. This was getting to some stuff that Brendan was already kind of asking about. So on the one hand, you can think about lost instructional time, and there's increasing, especially after the pandemic, people are thinking a lot about instructional time. And so you might expect, especially for a very long strike, that they would decrease student achievement because of that lost instructional time. And there's some work in other countries about very long strikes, and I'll talk about that in a minute, that does find evidence consistent with that. And one thing with the short strikes that's worth keeping in mind, because there is some literature from one of my co-authors that's these small disruptions can really, even small losses of instructional time can really affect student achievement. But it's probably worth mentioning that for the short strikes, a lot of times if they happen, then kids will make up the days during a holiday or in the extra snow days at the end of the year. So some districts in Pennsylvania where strikes are legal, sort of have these strike days baked in as possible makeup days. And of course, the learning that happens on those days baked in at the end of the semester or the end of the year might not be as good. So you could still think about maybe even these short strikes affect student achievement.
So you might get to this later, so feel free to defer it, but I'm curious about the degree to which these teacher strikes are preceded by negative shocks or negative trends. To what extent are teachers asked to increase effort without increased pay or decreased pay? And I'm curious about whether we should think about this as returning to equilibrium from out of equilibrium, or are we kind of starting with equilibrium? This is kind of getting to a new equilibrium steady state.
Yeah, and we tried, so we're not really able to say something definitive on that at all. There are a couple of things that we tried to do that made it into the paper, a couple of things we tried to do where it was just not definitive enough to really say something. But it's a combination of both are happening here. So in some places, like empirically, in using our estimation strategy, it looks like salaries increased, but that's probably because they were able to hold off salary decreases. So we're still kind of conceptualizing that as a positive effect on compensation. And in some places, compensation is actually going up. But in a lot of the places, like compensation is not actually going up. It's just that they're like holding off losses to compensation. But there's like, it's not super definitive. Yeah, Brendan?
So on this teacher strikes as public signals, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So what are the types of public signals you have in mind? Like you sort of said this and on a, perhaps I'm attaching an adjective that you wouldn't apply, like an altruistic motive where it's like things are just, bad things are happening in the schools and the strike is to make the public aware of this bad situation. But so I guess my question is like, are they signaling things like teacher pay is not high enough and teachers' working conditions are not good? Or are they saying, you know, this curriculum is not serving students well? Like, to me, is it more of the former? Does it still relate mostly to teacher compensation?
Yeah, so the way for the signaling, I'm gonna be brief, but there's a lot more in the actual paper.
Sure.
But the way that we think about it is not really an altruistic way. But the idea being that like strikes are very costly, and in a lot of places they're illegal. So like they're costly because they're costly to organize. Strikes are incredibly difficult to organize. Even when they are legal, you have to get like it varies depending on the state, but in some places you need a 2/3 vote of all the folks in the bargaining unit. So even non-members who might be like within the bargaining unit. And there's so there's a lot of organization and effort that goes into making sure and getting everybody on board, and then also making sure everybody knows like which days not to show up. And then there's also the costs associated with like penalties from striking, where you might lose pay. So some states have it where you lose 2 days of pay for every day that you go on strike. So strikes are very costly, but the idea that we put out is that they're unequally costly depending on the like opportunity costs of not striking. And so that like in the places where the opportunity costs are not striking are greatest, they're going to be more likely to strike and therefore can credibly like signal to the public that there are real problems happening. And even though it's like 772 strikes, it sounds like a lot, it's still like relatively infrequent. So like the average year is seeing about 12.5 strikes across the whole country. So we're thinking about this as like trying to expand the way that we think about like management, such that because of the sort of complicated systems of education, finance, and because they're public sector workers, that they're talking not just to like their managers. It's not just like I'm trying to talk to my superintendent. It's not just the product of this, failed negotiation with the superintendent, but they're also sort of petitioning to the public and potentially to like state leaders and other like leaders who have a say in education finance decisions that like we need more money. And it could still be like a power thing that's like we are, desperate enough that we are willing to go on strike to like have more money. But it's the idea is sort of expanding the way that we think about strikes as more than just part of a like failed negotiation process. Mm-hmm.
A lot of the points here, as I understand them, seem to be quite short-run effects, whereas it sounds like your results are largely in the medium term. I'm just trying to square these a little bit, and part of my thinking on this is just to understand how much is this like a district treatment versus a teacher treatment, where the set of teachers who choose to join after a strike may be systematically different, either because of selection on the teachers or because of choices by the superintendent. In part, I think of like the increased spending effects as coming through changes in teacher quality. And if you're just giving existing teachers more money, you may not get changes in quality. It would have to come through, say, for example, teachers now saying, oh, this district's quite responsive, so now I'm going to select in, but not be deterred by, say, like the public signal that comes from the fact that they're willing to strike.
Yeah. I totally agree with you there. I think that like that is how we are thinking about the like likely downstream consequences that we're not really able to observe on like changes to the compensation, I mean, to the, not composition of the teacher workforce that could potentially downstream affect student achievement. Is that what you meant?
Or is it because the data is district level?
Yeah.
Do you see like percent of teachers with a master's degree or something along those lines?
No, yeah, we don't really look at anything quality wise. I don't, yeah.
It's not, as someone who's not in this space, it's not obvious to me how a superintendent would respond to changes in recruitment. and
Yeah,
retention.
yeah.
But I could imagine that some of the increase in salaries would change in their.
Yeah, so what we also talk about in the paper is that it could be, and this is true, so if you look at a lot of these strikes that occurred in like Oklahoma, Arizona, West Virginia, a big part of the conversation around the strikes was that teachers were having to work multiple jobs, for example. So you could think about even higher compensation, even if teachers are sort of working at their maximum effort, if you're still working your maximum effort, but now you only have to work one job instead of two jobs because your salary is increased, you may then, that could like improve the quality of instruction through like your compensation improving. But then it's even, I would say, we still think about that as like an ambiguous effect because if teachers are already giving maximum effort in their instructional, like in their instructional time, you wouldn't necessarily expect to see an effect on achievement.
And just a quick point that I think relates to what Andrew raised, and that is an 8% increase in salaries rarely ends up meaning every teacher gets an 8% raise, right? These raises get distributed differently,
Yeah.
especially in bargaining units that have the power to strike. They often get much more heavily weighted to the back end of the schedule where you're much less likely to get increases in the quality of teaching because at the front end of the schedule, if the salaries aren't going up, what's the incentive for higher quality people to enter? And I think over this whole period, as you probably know better than I do, starting salaries have actually fallen.
Yeah.
Nationally, and I would assume in almost all these states that you're looking at. And so I think there's just a bunch of reasons to believe that you're not going to find student achievement effects here.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. And that's really helpful. I'm trying to write it down, but not like take too much time writing it down. And that we also may just not be, sorry, well, anyway, it's a really good point. Yeah, I agree. Oh, and so, yes, we kind of talked about all of these. One thing that's also worth mentioning is that it probably matters if they're reallocations versus coming from new revenues, because if you're raising teacher salaries, but then you're like firing nurses, then that could be bad, right? So we're also going to look at whether or not they're coming from new revenues or reallocating from other sources. Okay, so some background on effects of strikes. I already alluded to this before. There have been a few studies, one really prominent recent study looking at the effects of teacher strikes on student outcomes outside of the US. And these are for the most part finding a negative effect for students for long strikes. In Canada, they find a negative effect for strikes lasting more than 10 days, which is more common in Canada. The strikes tend to last longer in Canada. And then the new one that has gotten a lot of attention is this, I'm not sure how to say his name, I've never met him, but I'm gonna say Jaume, because that's how I read it. And Will in 2019 study, and this is a figure from their study, this is just a correlation, but they do estimate the causal effect of exposure to teacher strikes on kids' long-run labor market outcomes. And this is, I think, important to emphasize how different a context, because the mean kid that's experiencing these is losing 88 days of school to teacher strikes. So this is just vastly different context than what we're experiencing in the US, but they find that this exposure to 88 days of lost instructional time during elementary school associated with like 2 to 3% decrease in long-run labor market stuff. There's some work on this in the US, but it's older, it's looking at like a small subset of strikes largely in the 70s, and it's all correlational work. So we also have looked at the political effects of strikes. I already started to talk a little bit about this. This is a figure from my JHR paper with Matt Kraft.
Sorry, this is hopefully quick, and I think it speaks to Andrew's question about like the temporal piece in terms of outcomes. So if you go back a slide to the 88 days, which is a lot of days, but you're presenting like the long run labor outcomes, right? That's really distal.
Yeah, that's really, yeah.
And so like, what did they find, just so we can benchmark with what you find in terms of like shorter term, more proximal outcomes?
Great question. And this, I actually meant to say this, so I appreciate you coming back to it. So the Helmy and Willem folks who are looking at the strikes in Argentina, they don't have any short-term outcomes. The strikes in Canada, they do look at short-term outcomes. And what they find is for these long strikes, so 10 days or more, lead to about a 3% of a standard deviation decrease in math achievement, only in certain grades. The rationale for why we would see an effect in certain grades and not others isn't totally clear for me, but it varies depending on, there are two studies in Canada. One is like grades 5 and 6, and the other one is like grades 3 and 6 or something. So 3% of a standard deviation decrease in math for long, for Canadian strikes lasting more than 10 days. Okay, and then in the US, so I told you we put out this idea about strikes as public signals. And so the way that we test that idea is to look at whether or not strikes change the conversations in congressional election campaigns, so non-education elections. And what we find is that teacher strikes dramatically increase the likelihood that you would see a campaign ad that mentions education. And so it's 130% increase. It's stronger in the period closest to the election when ads seem to matter the most. It's also strongest in competitive areas, and essentially even just the average increase, this like 130% average increase, it's essentially moving ads mentioning education to the level that you might expect or to the level, it starts at the level, education is on the same level as veterans ads. So you can think about like, do you see political ads that are talking about veterans very much? Not really. To the level of jobs ads. So ads mentioning like employment or jobs. So it's like a really major increase in the way that our political candidates are talking about education. And then we also start to look at some effects on education spending. We didn't have as much data at that time as we do in this one, so we couldn't include the coordinated red thread strikes in that one. Then also Alexander Hurdle Fernandez at Columbia also has a paper looking at 2018 red thread strikes showing that they had a positive impact on parents who were exposed to the strikes on their like interest in increasing teacher salaries and also their views on labor more generally. Okay, so this paper, our first question is how common are teacher strikes? And to do that, we had to create a new data set because, as I mentioned, Bureau of Labor Statistics is only tracking strikes that have 1,000 striking workers or more. We got administrative data from Pennsylvania at first, and then used that to develop a search process by which we could, through a pretty intensive search of news articles, find evidence of teacher strikes. So we searched about 90,000, reviewed about 90,000 news articles, and we validated that with a couple of other sources, including administrative data that we were able to also get from Illinois, where quite a few strikes happened. And then since 2021, Cornell also has a labor tracking that they're doing, which is exciting, and that includes teacher strikes. And so we've been able to also validate using some of their processes, and in the future, we could just use theirs. So here's a map of teacher strikes. The places where there were any coordinated strikes across districts at the same time, we put the date of the coordination there so you could kind of get a sense for like, so for example, Pennsylvania and Illinois have a lot of strikes, and California too, have a lot of teacher strikes that are all independent, whereas Arizona, Washington State, West Virginia, Oklahoma, they also have a lot of strikes, but these are coordinated strikes across districts. Those tend to be more common in places where strikes are illegal.
Stuff that like really surprises me, and especially the zeros. And so part of what has been in my head about thinking about the definition of strikes is what does it mean to need to close schools? So I could imagine that's, I guess from this map, states in particular have policies where like you need like 5 teachers. And we were gonna put the kids in the auditorium and they're gonna watch.
Yeah.
And like that's a strike, but it's not, I mean, in some sense, like how worried should we be, or how do we think about districts that intentionally don't close schools, but there is an effective strike on?
So
A lot of like false negatives.
we came up with, I think, 2 when in the search examples of that we don't count that. So if they keep school open, but they say like all the kids are gonna be in the auditorium watching movies, they didn't close school. So we stuck to our definition. I guess it's encouraging that we found only like a very few examples of this. It still shows up because the newspapers are reporting on it. But I don't think it's happening very often. And it's something we could, like, I do know because we kept track of anything that appeared to be a strike, and then like, if it didn't, we just put it in this like, not actually a strike section, according to our definition. So I could like do more with that, but I don't think it's very common. But you're thinking could relate to district policy. I think some of it is also,
This is really a question about how I interpret the effect. And
Yeah.
maybe another way to answer, another way to frame or phrase what you're doing is what is the effect of a large strike? Large, not the best word. But it seems like there's false negatives for somebody's, or based on a difference in agreement of what it means to have a strike versus there being like everything that's a large strike you're clearly capturing. Versus some like small strikes that are being put in the comparison group. And I want to know how to think about implementing a $10,000 change. And if part of my control group is getting a small treatment, that doesn't mean that could have been to think about the magnitude.
yeah, I think this also has come up more recently with some situations that pretty much we only captured during COVID, where like, it's hard to think about COVID because in some ways it was a partial strike. Teachers were withholding part of their labor. It's hard to, but they were also still they were like, to the extent that remote instruction was happening, they were still like doing the sort of academic part of their labor, but not the custodial part of their labor. So I think we could sort of characterize it as a full strike, right? And that if you still had some teachers who were willing to come to work and like watch the kids in the auditorium while they were doing movies, then you could think about that as potentially a partial strike because they weren't able to get all the teachers to actually like do the picket line. For the most part, there's like a lot of labor norms about crossing a picket line. So like there would be a heavy sort of social discouragement for that kind of like, I'm gonna be willing to like go into school so that school isn't closed. We did see what was more common than that was local newspapers reporting that some teachers were not walking the picket line and instead they would be at like a local church. And that if you needed to drop your kid at the local church because you had to get to work and you couldn't like watch your kid that day, then you could like, then they wouldn't call that crossing a picket line, but you could like drop your kid at the church and your kid would be safe while you went to work. But no instruction would be happening. It would be like just the custodial part. But yeah, I mean, I think that's fair.
Also, naive question here is, should we learn anything from maybe the threat of a strike? So these are, in my interpretation, these are somebody who's actually gone through with the threat. Should we think about sort of the relationship between a credible threat that a district faces and a non-credible threat?
I mean, I think that's related to, so we can't keep track of like the threat of strikes, or we didn't. We don't have a process by which we could do that. But it's also another reason, similar to Andrew's, to think that we could be underestimating the effects of teacher strikes.
Just to get a little more tangible on the tracking, like and sorry if I missed this, but we're using the administrative data to identify places where there were instructional stoppages and then searching in news articles for those places?
That's
Or-
how I originally created the process, yeah.
So you might not capture like strikes that were where there weren't instructional stoppages. Like I wonder if to get at this point, you could do the reverse, like search, for terms, like search terms associated with strikes.
Yeah, so, yeah, what do you mean?
In places where there weren't actually like instructional days lost, but where there was like basically like instructional time lost because kids were like in a gym with 5 teachers
The
watching a movie.
addition to that is if I strike Friday afternoon so that they get it resolved by Monday, and you give the district the weekend to figure it out. Like it would be analogous to you wouldn't capture it if there was effective pressure.
Yeah, so sometimes they'll do a vote. And so the way it works is that a lot of times the votes will happen on Friday evenings. And so then there'll be some pressure on the district to like do a counter offer before the actual strike happens. And we wouldn't count that as a strike. That would be a threat of a strike. But I wouldn't count that as a strike. So again, like, we're not really able to capture that. I mean, if we could, we do some like trying to look at the like, and we do, I mean, look just within places where strikes are legal and then just also within places where strikes have occurred, because you might think that like this threat would be more credible there. And the results are similar. They're a little bit smaller if we look just within places where strikes have occurred. Like the magnitude of the effects are a little smaller. But I haven't thought enough to like make sense of that in relation to the credibility of the threat of the strike, because it seems like you would have a more credible strike in that area, but it could be that it's because the counterfactual districts also have a credible threat strike. But if you have ideas about other things you would want to see or ways to cut it, I would be interested. Okay. So I already mentioned this about the, okay, and then teacher strikes tend to be short, probably a lot shorter than many people think. So the median strike is 2 days long. 90% of strikes are less than 10 days long. So that also helps to kind of contextualize the really major differences between the strikes that are happening in the US versus other countries. And also I think points more to this idea that it's not really just about like seeing how long the workers can hold out until management caves, that there's like more going on, because I mean, also partly because the people who are harmed are going to be innocent children. So that's also something that like teachers have to consider when they're striking. Then here you can see the number of strikes over time. Individual strikes are pretty steady, and there are these spurts of coordinated strikes in 2011 in Wisconsin, in 2015 in Washington, and then in 2018 and 2019. Collectively, strikes have impacted like 11.5 million students, and they're canceled 3,403 days of school. It's not like a simple average because you need to like also consider duration, but if you think about this as like student days lost, it strikes over this 16-year period led to about 48 million student days lost. So these are like, I think if you think about this in like numbers, pretty big. And then this is just like months of the year. The individual district strikes are occurring pretty much throughout the year, except no strikes in July ever. And the coordinated strikes, for whatever reason, seem to happen more, or do happen more so in the spring.
So earlier you had mentioned some districts will sort of add strike days to the end or the holidays and things like that. Do strikes change the testing schedules at all? Like,
I don't think so. So that's also like a little bit of a challenge. That was especially a challenge when at first we were just gonna do this in Pennsylvania. And so I've thought about it more so in Pennsylvania. So that's kind of a challenge to think about the year 0, right? Because it means fewer days until the test, but then potentially the same number of days of school period. And so then that could be one explanation for why the effects don't persist over time. The negative effect of the long strikes on student achievement doesn't persist over time. Yeah?
Also wondering if that's in part related to why you see such a big coordinated strike in April and May. Because like if your tests are done, you don't have to worry about preparing your students as much. A lot of tests tend to happen in spring.
Yeah. I will say sometimes we saw that the days, so for these earlier strikes, sometimes the days are made up in winter break. So if, and I think that's just up to the districts to decide. Okay, so why do they occur? Compensation is a key focus in all strikes. Working conditions was more so a focus in coordinated strikes than individual strikes. So like 7 out of 10 coordinated strikes have working conditions as a key demand compared to just 1 in 4 individual district strikes. And generally when working condition shows up, it's like we need more higher expenditures in schools. We need like more school funding. Sometimes it shows up as non-instructional staff, like we need more nurses, or we need to like pay our nurses more. And then labor rights came up mostly in the Wisconsin coordinated strike in 2011.
You get this information from the articles.
Right, so this is reported, yeah, so that's true. It's important to say that this came from our tracking from news article. So once you know of a strike, it's easier to get more information about it, but this is all just reported demands. Which strategically, unions are gonna have a reason for reporting certain things and not others as part of the demands. Although we did find one of the strike demands, I think this was in Illinois, was to prevent drug testing of teachers. And then they were public about that. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so I'm wondering, given that most of the coordinated strikes are in this Red for Ed thing, like how much of this is like a media savvy thing where the coordination is, we really want more compensation, but we also know it might be politically unpopular to just say, pay us more. And so in order to get, they know there's this media thing. So how much of it do you think is just like, we're gonna throw in working conditions in here to make it sort of seem a little more, I guess, altruistic than perhaps it is?
Yeah, it could very well be. And it could be like a sort of a shift. We see this more so in the more recent strikes period. And so it could also be like a broader shift in the way that teachers and unions are thinking about their strategies, where they're sort of realizing the importance of the like media narrative around strikes. And so they're using that to their advantage.
So are these coordinated strikes going with the working, because I think you have outcomes that are working condition outcomes.
Yeah.
Does it map on to what the demands are here?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
So it does. So the working conditions outcomes are larger for the coordinated strikes.
Got it.
So it does. So it could be true. Yeah. Okay. And then we also just look like empirically a baseline. So, I'll be honest, we're still sort of figuring out what's the best way to think about the causes of strikes. So this is just comparing in 2007, 2008, the characteristics of striking districts and non-striking districts. Striking districts tend to be lower spending, larger. They also have lower socioeconomic status. They also tend to be in places where so I can interpret this for you for a second. So 72% of striking districts are in states where strikes are prohibited, compared to 66% of non-striking districts, which was kind of a surprise, but also comes back to this idea of that strike illegality might not matter that much.
Used the longitudinal, within district, looking at how does, if real teacher salaries are falling over time in a district, is there a point in which it's okay, now we're gonna strike because we're so far away from where it was when we last increased the teacher salaries? Because I think this comparison between a district that does and doesn't strike, it's I don't know if you're a teacher in a district, you're well, they're getting paid more. It's well, we haven't gotten a raise in 10 years. And so now we're gonna decide to go on strike.
So there's kind of two things you're saying there. One of them we did do, but one of them we didn't. One is the experience of declining real wages. So that's change over time, right? And then another one is the experience of my wages are not going up, and I'm seeing other districts around me
Sure.
that are going up. And so that one we do look at.
Yeah.
And I could show you that, and I'm still, like, I think it's in the appendix of the paper, because I'm still like, it's just like a lot of stuff, and I'm not totally sure what to make sense, how to make sense of it. But, I haven't done it with the, like the change over time way of thinking about it yet. Yes?
So I'm partly to Andrew's point, but I think if the columns weren't just, I'm taking that striking districts are districts that ever struck during your
Right,
period. And make this into a district by year
yeah,
counting so that you can understand the difference both the within and between parts.
yeah. Here, I'll just show you that, because want mine as well, right? So it's gonna be a messy table. I apologize. But this is like in our this is appendix table A5. So this is and this is scaled as a percent change. Okay, so I put it in the table notes to remind me. So here we're regressing the outcome on an indicator of whether the district went on strike in that year with year fixed effects. So and then we divide it by the mean and then multiply by 100. So we essentially you're getting at the percent difference in that trait between striking and non-striking districts in that year. And this, I got the idea from the Mason Coffin Wilmer's paper. It's sort of similar to what they did. But so here it is. I'm not totally sure what to do with it. So if you have thoughts on that.
But doesn't this sort of just get a more precise comparison of the previous table as opposed to the within versus between, which I think is what people are asking about? This is still a between
This is still between,
comparison.
yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So you could do something like this that would rely on within district variation over time.
yeah, so I could do it like with district, I mean, I could do it with two-way fixed effects, I guess. Or I could do it like with district fixed effects instead of year fixed effects.
State fixed effects would also be interesting.
Yeah, so I think in the paper, but I didn't put it in here, I also do it with state fixed. Appendix table A5.
And eventually, so far where it started.
Okay. So, yeah, I don't know how to do the little links in the presentation, or I learned and then didn't do it, so you just get to see the little preview. I already did the too long, didn't read. Yeah.
So I'm just like, on your previous slide about the characteristics of striking districts, I'm trying to think about like how, okay, we see spending increases on average, but like, what are the implications for equity? Because, you know, you could imagine that the districts that strike are, you know, have worse conditions, but also that the teachers there are higher capacity and, you know, if they're better organized, that it's like, you know, sort of reinforces inequity of spending or student outcomes. I understand you can't really look at student outcomes far out, but maybe with spending. Anyway, so I'm just trying to like think about the implications for equity.
Yeah. It sort of relates also
Yeah.
to Jim's point earlier that like the salary increases are probably not going to be distributed evenly. And so if you have more early career teachers that are not getting as much of a increase, and then those are disproportionately at schools that are like serving less advantaged students, then you could think about something with that. Yeah. I do look at achievement gaps, but we don't find anything with achievement gaps. But I don't look at like school spending gaps. Or so I could think, if you have more specific ideas, we'll talk about it later. Okay, so I'm using a event study, a non-parametric differences strategy. It's pretty straightforward. So essentially I'm acknowledging that like striking districts and non-striking districts are probably different for all sorts of reasons. And strikes are not occurring randomly. So I'm using the trends in the non-striking districts to develop a proxy for what I think would happen in the striking districts based on what was happening prior to the strike for them. And then I'm estimating the effect as essentially the difference between that proxy and what actually happens in the striking districts. And so importantly, my big assumption then is essentially that these not striking districts provide a valid counterfactual for the trend that we would expect to occur in the striking district. And so one benefit is that I'm also going to be able to look at what's happening in the pre-period to at least see if in the pre-period before the strike, if there's any reason to believe that they were on differential trends prior to the strike. So empirically, I'm doing this in a non-parametric way. So I'm estimating the effects separately for each year in the 5 years pre-strike and the 5 years post-strike. And then I have just a few controls, and we show it without the controls, and it looks almost identical. And then we've got district and school fixed effects, and we use the methodological literature, as some of you, especially grad students who want to use diff and diff, are probably too aware, has been hating on diff and diff with staggered treatment for a while. And so we use the Callaway and Santana estimator to address potential biases from heterogeneous treatment effects with the staggered timing. Okay, so the big findings. So here, starting with compensation, and I'm showing, this is the logged compensation, and then this is just raw dollars. Right now in the paper, we have logged because we're trying to talk to an econ audience, but like, I think you guys probably also can appreciate the real dollars. So we don't see the increase right away. And this is consistent with just like qualitatively how it looks like these strikes progress. Even when they're negotiating with states, a lot of times it will be like a 3% increase at first, and then a 4%, and then 5%, it's like sort of scales up. And then if we extend out, it doesn't look like it keeps going up. It just sort of levels off and stays there. I see, give me one second. And then it looks very similar in the dollars, and it's roughly about $1,000 in year 5, and then essentially stays there. So that's partly why we don't really have the ability to look. So the school finance literature is going to say 4 years of sustained increases of about, so this is $10,000 teacher salaries. I'm going to show you student achievement. School spending also. So I'll come back to that. Question.
Yeah, just kind of given the existing discussion, should we be surprised by the parallel pre-strikes? Like if we thought that the strikes were preceded by these treated districts having salaries that grow slower than untreated districts, I would have maybe like say negative pre-trend, but the fact that it's parallel or it's flat suggests that maybe that didn't happen.
Yes.
So if I'm recalling the strike data that you showed us, the year strike data, an awful lot of the strikes occurred in 18 and 19, 2018, 2019. But your data for the, if I recall correctly, for the finance stuff ends in 1920.
Yeah.
So I'm a little concerned about years 3, 4, and 5 being identified off of the very small sample that occurred earlier, and in particular in 2014, 2015 from state of Washington, if I'm recalling what you showed us earlier.
So we do look at, just to say, so, okay, I see what you mean. So, we did a lot with this because we were especially worried about this before we had 2019, 2020 data in the paper. So I don't think it's totally addressing your concern, but I can show you. So in the paper, one thing we do is just drop the coordinated strikes, but we also, so we don't have, we're limited by the data that we have. But when we drop the coordinated strikes, or if we just look at coordinated strikes, we still see the similar effect, but it could be just driven by the Wisconsin and Washington ones. So yeah, we're only able to look at the red 2019 strikes in the year of the strike, right?
And if you, just to follow.
No, in the year after the strike, sorry, in year 0 and year 1, yeah.
Right, and so have you estimated this with just a balance panel out for 5 years?
Yeah.
So that you can see sort of consistent set of year 1, year 2, and so on estimates using all the same data.
Yes, I love a balanced panel, Well, like, this was a big thing in my dissertation, because I was like trying to explain to everybody in the world why like this balance panel really mattered. And we did originally, I haven't done it with when we got the more recent data, but it would be a great idea to include it in the paper, yeah.
I just wanna follow up on.
Yeah.
A little bit. One is, it's not just about the events, it's also about the change in sample composition.
Mhm.
Right, so like when you're looking out, you're comparing a set of places that have this data to someone who's not in the pre-trans, because you could have differential selection to be. So it's both the events and like the sample composition thing that I'd be worried about. But sort of the related point to that, and a little to Derek's point, is like, I'm maybe surprised by the pre-trans given the story, but also like a lot of your never treated group, or your comparison group here, are like states where there's just not strikes. And I'm just like, I guess your pre-trans look good, so maybe you want to think of them as a valid comparison, but there's like something institutionally weird about these places where there's just never a strike. You implicitly have state fixed effects because you have district fixed effects. And it's just like, I'm not entirely sure what the I'm not really sure who the effective comparison is. And I don't know if I'm worried about it, but I'm just like unsure who it is because of the way the fixed effects interact with the nature of the treatment cost.
Yeah, and so one of the robustness checks that we do, and I can show you the results if you want to see now or later, is to only look at places with strikes. So only look within states that experience strikes.
So then fully identifying what the different type.
Well, but there are districts in those states that don't have strikes.
Oh, only using states where there's.
Yeah. So, and then, and I don't want to say something that's not true, but I think the results are pretty similar, but maybe the magnitude is slightly smaller. But I can show you, we have it in, I have it in. Yeah. So this is, just looking at salary and benefits. This is log, so it helps to kind of see it in the log form here because they're split proportionately. So salaries are going up more than benefits, but that's because more expenditures go towards salary than benefits. But if you think about it as a percent change, they're going up in similar ways. And then we look at like a bunch of different ways of measuring working conditions. I'm just showing you two here. Essentially, pupil-teacher ratios go down by about half of a student. And expenditures on working conditions. So this is expenditures on anything that's not teacher salaries and benefits, essentially, goes up. We dig into this to try to like be more specific. And it's really like, this is really coming from expenditures on other employees' salaries and benefits. So like capital expenditures not affected, and like non-salary and benefit expenditures are also not affected.
What's weird about this one is the working conditions people were the coordinators and they were all in they were all in the 2019-20. And so they're not contributing to the large increase in this plot because of the unbalanced panel issue, right?
Well, there's still Washington State and Wisconsin, and it's possible that they didn't, like, I do know that working conditions has become a more common demand over time, but I can't remember off the top of my head. I mean, it's helpful to think about, and it's something we could go into more, if the coordinated strikes that occurred in 2011 and 2015 also involved demands for working conditions.
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of this also relates to like the dynamics that we're seeing, which again is gonna sample composition. Like, is this a dynamic treatment effect or is this a compositional effect? I think is an important thing to try to, because I don't know what my prior would have been about what the dynamics would be, but it is, I don't know, that, you know, it's interesting that there's it's an uptick. It sort of takes a while to manifest. I think in the paper you talk about, there's probably good reasons to think why that would be the case, because it takes some time to change budgets, but it could also be this composition thing.
Yeah. So this is the expenditures per pupil. This is about $1,000 here. So this is in log points. It's like a 7-8%, maybe 9% increase. Again, happens over time. And then I'll show you in a second what it looks like if we take it all the way out. But this is part of the issue with trying to think about the comparisons with the Money Matters literature, because you'd only expect to see an effect on achievement according to like the Jackson and Makovickia's meta-analysis after 4 years of having expenditures increase that much.
Sorry,
Yeah.
quick thing with this, with the modeling here, are you dummying out all of these years and just reporting -5 to 5?
Yeah. No, actually, we're doing the Callaway and Santana estimator. So it's essentially estimating each one separately and then bringing them together. So we're just like not estimating those periods.
So there's not, you're just
Yeah,
grabbing
Just
10-year,
running each
you're
one separately.
grabbing windows. You're,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I got it.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of related. I'm wondering have you thought about using the Sun and Abraham like cohort average treatment effect separately and just kind of seeing if if it seems like there's heterogeneous effects or if it's like it's different.
Yeah. Looking at different cohort numbers.
Yeah.
We haven't done that. It's a good idea.
My question is similar. I mean, can we just see, do you have the Callaway group estimates? They're gonna estimate by cohort. Do we have the
I
cohort?
mean, we could get them. I didn't put them in I haven't paid any attention to them at this, up to this point.
Okay. I wonder if that sort of gets at the 2014 versus 2019 issue. To some extent, I don't think completely.
The 24, sorry,
I think there's a concern about who's the balanced panel. They're 3, 4, 5. I'm just worried about, maybe I'm incorrectly interpreting this, the heterogeneous treatment effects that may occur between 2014 grouping and 2019. But I could be completely wrong.
okay. So, and then this, it looks like the new revenue, so it's coming from new revenues. It's not coming from reallocations because we see revenues are increasing pretty consistent with expenditures. And then it looks like the new revenues are coming from state sources, which makes oh, we're out of time? Okay.
That's trying to be subtle.
Okay. So here, no effect on student achievement, pretty precisely estimated nulls. And then this is what I was alluding to before, where we take it all the way out. And so you can see like, okay, we now with this small group of strikes, we can see that the expenditures increase. So they have higher average increases than like the rest of the group, but the expenditures increase persists past year 5. And then we have noisy estimates of student achievement, but it could be consistent with the school finance literature. So this is the difference between longer and shorter strikes. We don't see a big difference on most things except for math achievement, where we see longer strikes are leading to this like year 0 and year 1 decline, but then it goes back. And so some robustness checks that we do, I've already talked about a few of those, which is helpful to like talk about them in context. And I have a lot of implications, but that was just extra in case I like needed more stuff. So the big things to remember are like 772 strikes. They focus on compensation and teachers are able to achieve increases in compensation. And that we make sense of the state revenues increases as consistent with this signaling effect. It's also like intuitive for the strikes that are coordinated, but it's not just limited to the coordinated strikes. It's all the strikes that are getting new revenues from the state that could have to do with states changing their allocations. And then this is just a little sense making on the achievement stuff. We've already talked a lot about that. And the implications I think are still like a little bit unclear to me, but I think one potential implication that we could think about for policy is with regard to just the changing nature of public sector labor laws. So here in Virginia, we've seen the collective bargaining newly become legal in 2020. And then across the board in all states, Janus decision made every teacher in a K-12 school system essentially working in a right to work context. So these kinds of changes to the nature of labor policy bring up, I think, questions about what our state labor policy should be. And our research success suggests that like illegality of strikes is probably not in and of itself meaningful in terms of preventing strikes, but there may be some aspects by which it is and isn't.
Sorry, can I ask you a
Yeah.
quick, I know we're at time, but can you go back to the slide? Because the
Yeah.
implications feel very important to me. In particular, like in conversation with your work with Matt around the teaching profession.
Yeah.
The historical low point, and in like a minute, I would be interested to know your thoughts on how you think about this work, speaking to that work. As we think about, broader conversations about the teaching profession.
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind first that like strikes are, like within relation to strikes are desperate events that teachers are only, that these are not still, even though we're finding like a relatively large number of strikes, these are still not happening very frequently, and they're still very, very costly to organize and to carry out. And so they're pretty desperate, but we also see that this is a time where like the teaching profession is facing historic lows across a number of different measures: prestige, student interest in teaching, teacher preparation, job satisfaction. So it's a time where you might expect that teachers are feeling especially desperate. So if we think about these two things in combination, then I think it's a moment where we could be concerned that strikes might become more common. I also think that their sort of signaling effect is less powerful when strikes are more common. So I think if we see continued increases in teacher strikes, then I think some of their effects will they'll probably become less powerful, particularly for the short strikes. So then you may see also teachers that are willing to go on strike for longer because they're not able to achieve the goals that they want with the like short strikes where the signaling effects are more important.
Yeah, I mean, that's helpful. And I just think like Jim's comment earlier about like who's getting more money.
Yeah.
As a result of the strikes, and then where those teachers are allocated in terms of tested grades and subjects. I mean, I just think like thinking about the work like more broadly would be helpful for the field, because I do think it's like we might not expect these things to matter in the same way for the people we most want to keep, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So.
And I think especially for these coordinated strikes, so there's a woman who I went to her talk, I'm sure it's going to be published at some point, has a paper that's focused specifically on Arizona. And she shows that because it went through the state essentially, and this could be also an explanation for why when we just limit to striking states, the effects are a little bit smaller. The state just raised the expenditures through their pre-existing funding formula, and it ended up going to more so to like higher income districts because the salary increases were so like the increased expenditures went more so to the more advantaged districts that didn't go on strike because they funneled it through their pre-existing funding formula, which didn't account for like student advantage, but did account for teacher experience. And so like that, there's like serious equity implications for that. And also, I mean, for labor as a whole, if you think about the like the way, and so probably has a deterrent effect on strikes because of the strategy they pursued, right? Because it sort of, some ways they did what they said they were gonna do, but it kind of punished the striking districts.
I think we have to wrap up.
Yeah.
Because we're a little bit over. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate all the comments. I really do.
Enjoyed it together.
Yes.